A couple of items related to last week. I just wanted to kind of a postscript to something which I said last week, and there was some discussion back and forth about. And so, for the sake of intellectual honesty, I guess you could call it, okay, I just want to put my phone on Do Not Disturb so that I don't get. Um, okay. We had a conversation about the Shevet Ephraim in this place called Beit Choron, and where Beit Choron was. And I had said that it was in the area of Ephraim, and some suggestion about whether or not that was moved from where it is today. So I actually did a little bit of research. Beit Choron will come up a lot because we're going to see it in Perek Yud, and we're going to see it in other places in Sefer Yehoshua. Beit Choron is described well, we looked at it. We looked at it in the context of chapter 7 and sorry, of Divrei Hayamim, and the reference to how it was founded by the children and grandchildren of Ephraim. If you look at a map, Beit Choron today is if I'm going to zoom into this map for a moment. I don't know if you can see this map, but here is Yerushalayim. And so Beit Choron today is a little bit north. It's almost near, it's actually the road Latrun, Shalavim, sort of that area is where Beit Choron is today. And what struck me from our discussion last week was that it made no sense to it only made sense to me intuitively that Beit Choron be in the tribal territory of Ephraim, because it was founded by Ephraim and it was given to Ephraim in Sefer Yehoshua. And so by putting it west of sort of this line, kind of Bethel, southwest of Bethel, it sort of sounded to me like it was going to the tribal territory of Binyamin, because Binyamin essentially is everything from Yerushalayim to Beit El. And so if I go a little bit west of that, it sounded to me like it was in Shevet Binyamin. The resolution of that dilemma in my mind, I started to look up, is that in fact, that's exactly the question. And why, if you look at the map, you see that the tribal territory of Ephraim, while north of Binyamin for the most part, dips down into a section that would have otherwise been, let's say, Shevet Dan, which is the orange, specifically because Beit Choron and Uzin She'ela, and here's Shalavim today, right? Some of those places belong to Shevet Ephraim. So that's exactly the issue, is that Beit Choron needed to be sort of almost annexed into Shevet Ephraim because it was founded by Ephraim. It is actually a little bit closer to the sort of center of the country than putting it into Har Ephraim itself. So anyways, that's a postscript from last week, which I owed you for the sake of clarity. Okay. We're jumping into chapter 9 today. That is our subject, is to start a new section of the Sefer. So chapter 8 ended the Battle of Ai, and then we had this kind of interlude, or this I don't know what you want to call it, a kind of parenthetical aside, historically, where they go all the way up to Shechem for the ceremony of the blessings and curses. And I showed you on a map, if this is where they are in Gilgal, Yericho, they come up to Ai and then they head north. If they go up this way, they'll get to Shechem on the mountain ridge at the top of the mountain of the Shomron Mountains. If they go up the coast, they end up going into Shechem from what is known in the Torah as Derech Mevoah Shemesh, the western road. That's the way the Torah describes going to Shechem or going to Agrizim and Areval, to go via the road called Derech Mevoah Shemesh. So if they go to Ai, I'm assuming they went to Ai and then north to Shechem rather than going up the coast. In all cases, the next part of the story takes us into the story of the Givonim. So I want to read through the parak first, or at least a good part of it, and then we'll take a step back in time to discuss. So for today, our goal is to introduce the story and then deal with some of the issues. ויהי כשמוע כל המלכים אשר בעבר הירדן, בהר ובשפלה ובכל חוף הים הגדול, על מול הלבנון. It came to pass when all the kings on the west side of the Jordan, in the hill country, in the lowlands, in the shore, in the sea, in Lebanon, Hachitiya, Amoriya, Canaanea, Perizia, Chivipa, Yebusi, all the 6 out of the 7 nations of Canaan. There's one nation that we saw in the beginning of the Sefer that's not mentioned here, and that is Girgashi. Chazal suggest that Girgashi ran when they saw Israel coming, and the reference or the indication to that is that Girgashi is mentioned in the list of the 7 nations of Canaan in the beginning of the Sefer, but by chapter 9 already they are dropped. So you have the Chiti, Amori, Knani, Prizi, Chivi, and Yevusi. ויתקבצו יחדיו להילחם עם יהושע ועם ישראל פה אחד. They gathered together to unite against Yehoshua and Israel with one voice, פה אחד, one accord, one goal, and that is to defeat Israel. On the other hand, V'yoshvei Giv'on shamu et asher asa Yehoshua liYericho v'la'ai. The inhabitants of Giv'on heard what Yeshua had done to Yericho and to Ai. V'yasu gam hema be'orma. They too worked wisely, cunningly, depending on how you define orma. וילכו ויצטיירו ויקחו שקים בלים לחמוריהם ונותות יין בלים ומוקעים וצוררים. They went and they made as if they had been messengers. They took old sacks, they took wine skins that were worn and rent and mended, alot balot mutulaot b'raglahem, and worn and patched shoes upon their feet and worn garments upon them, uslamot simla salma balot alehen, clothes that had been worn. And they took and they took bread that was already dry and had become crumbs. They came to Yeshua in Gilgal, and they said to Yeshua and to the leadership of Israel, we have come from a faraway land, now make a covenant with us. I'm going to stop here for a moment because the rest of the story, as we say, is we'll see as it unfolds. But there's a couple of things right at the beginning that we need to address. We're all familiar with the story of the Givonim, right? They disguise themselves as if they're a faraway nation and they've taken a long journey to get here when they're really around the corner. How around the corner are they? So let's first start with basic geography. I'll come back to this map, which we've had a few times. Gilgal is here on the coast. Ai is here, Beit El. Beit El is right next to each other. And Shem, this is the area that we've been focusing on up until now. Givon is right here in the center of the country, a little bit northwest of Yerushalayim. I'll pinpoint that a little bit more for you in a moment. So you can see clearly that they are very close. If Yerushalayim are the Jebusites or the Yebusim, Givon are the Chivim. And they're referred to as the Chivim in many places in the story. So they're really very close, and yet they disguise themselves as if they are far away, and we will explore why that is the case in a moment. But the story begins with a very interesting phrase, and it's this phrase that I want to pick up on. ויהי כשמוע כל המלאכים אשר בעבר הירדן, בהר ובשפלה ובכל חוף הים הגדול, מול הלבנון, החיתי, האמורי, הכנעני, הפריזי, החיבי והיבוסי, ויתקבצו יחדיו להילחם עם יהושע ועם ישראל ביחד. When all the nations and the kings of Canaan on the east, on the west side of the Jordan, whether in the hills or in the valley or on the sea and the coast, when all of these nations that are listed here, they heard what was going on, they gathered together to fight against Yeshua. This is not the first time we've heard this phrase. And in fact, it's a phrase that has come to kind of navigate us through many of the stories of the Sefer. In other words, it's almost a map, a phrase that turns into a kind of map to navigate, to understand what's going on in the book. And one of the things that we've said from the very beginning is that Yehoshua, from the moment he steps into the land, knows that he's facing two very significant tactical and strategic challenges. One is the unity of the nations of Canaan. He's fighting against the clock. And the goal is to conquer Canaan, to take control of the land as quickly as possible, because if the Canaanites gather together as they seem to be doing here, then they become stronger in numbers. And Yehoshua has the advantage if he's fighting one city at a time, very big disadvantage if he's fighting all of the cities together. And that's one of his agendas, one of his issues. The other, as we've seen already in a few times, is the walls and the goal to remove the Canaanites, find a way to chase them out of their walled cities, and that will become very evident in the next story, chapter 10 and chapter 11. But if I take a look at the opening phrase, "V'hi kishmo kol hamelachim," I just want to jump for 1 second to the next chapter, chapter 10. "V'hi kishmoa Adoni Tzedek melech Yerushalayim, ki lechad Yehoshua ta'ai ve'achlima." When Adoni Tzedek, king of Yerushalayim, heard that Yehoshua had conquered Ai and destroyed it, kasher asali Yericho l'malkah, and had done to it what it did to Yericho and to its king, ken asala Ai l'malkah, so it did to Ai and its king, v'chi ishlimu yoshvei givonot Yisrael v'yu b'kirvam, and the fact that, in the chapter we're going to learn today, that they made peace with an alliance with the cities of Givon, vayiru ma'od. They were afraid. Ki Gdola Givon. Givon was a great city. Kechatare Mamlacha was one of the great empire cities. V'chi Gdola min Ai, it was even greater than Ai. It was bigger than Ai. V'chol anshe Giborim, its people were mighty warriors. And so, Vayishlach Adoni Tzedek melech Yerushalayim, Eloah melech Hebron, V'Elpira melech Yarmut, V'Elyafir melech Lachish, V'Eltvi melech Eglon, Lemor Elu Elai V'Yizuni. So Adoni Tzedek reached out to all of the regional kings, city-state kings in his territory, the king of Hebron, and the king of Yarmut, and the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. And he says, come and help me, and let's defeat the Givonim, and we'll defeat Yehoshua and Israel together. In other words, you see in the beginning of chapter 10 an emerging of exactly what Yehoshua is afraid of all along, that the Canaanites are going to come together. Again, we'll learn this story separately. I want to just jump forward one chapter, chapter 11. Vayhi kishmo Yavin melech Chatzor. When Yavin, king of Chatzor, heard what had just transpired, Israel defeated the kings of the south, וישלח אל יובב מלך מדון, ואל מלך שמרון, ומלך עכשיו, ואל המלכים אשר מצפון, בהר ובערבה, נגב, כנרות ובשפלה, ובנפות דור מים, הכנענים ממזרח ומים, והאמורי, והחיתי, והפריזי, והיבוסי, בהר, והחיתי תחת החרמון, בארץ המצפה. He sent and he gathered all the regional kings in the north, as many as he could gather together. They and all their hosts together, they and their hosts, even as the sand of the sea, multitudes, horses and chariots. You see the pattern emerging. The longer we wait, or the longer the battle takes, the more the nations of Canaan are going to try to unify and expand in response. And so Yehoshua is fighting the clock. And how he deals with that, and how he deals with the issue of the unity, the walls, we will see as we merge and as we move through the story. All of this, in contrast, I want to show you another reference, similar type of reference. Well, let's go back to chapter 5, which is before, right after remember the end of chapter 4, they crossed the Yarden. And there we read the following, Vayhi kishmoa, kol malchei Amoria shebe'ever hayarden yama, when all of the nations of Canaan on the west side of the Jordan heard, V'chol malchei Knani asher alayam, and all of the kings of the Canaanites by the sea, God dried out the Jordan River from Israel, allowing them to cross. Their hearts melted, and they no longer had any spirit to fight against Israel. So what I find fascinating is that this phrase, Vayhi Kishmoa, is sort of like this map that navigates through the whole Sefer. I charted it out for you here. There are actually, technically there are five, but there are four places where you see this phrase, Vayhi Kishma. Again, we saw these five, I just showed you these four references. When they crossed the Jordan, that set them in fear. They were ready to melt and to run. Then you have the beginning of chapter 9, which is the first story post the Battle of Ai. And as we said when we studied the Battle of Ai, that the impact of having lost the initial battle, even though they won the war, kind of encouraged the Canaanites to turn, and rather than run, now there's a chance they can gather together and fight. And so the story of Ai is a turning point, because we go from the fear that they have to an actual attempt to either make peace with us, an alliance, or to fight us. Same phrase, but in this case, unlike in chapter 5, they heard and they gathered together to fight, all except Givon, we'll talk about in a moment. Similarly, in chapter 10, the battles of the south, the kings of the south, they gathered together to fight. In the north, they gathered together to fight. So this sense of the Canaanites responding to what they're hearing, either in fear or to be encouraged now that they see that Israel is defeatable, right? You get a sense that it's navigating us through this whole story. And that's really what one of the things that it highlights for us is a kind of division of the whole book. And one of the things that I don't know if we really discussed this at the beginning of our study of Sefer Yehoshua, but there really are, there's, I would say, 3 or 4 parts to the whole book. The entire book as a whole, all of Yehoshua, really divides very neatly into 2 parts, 2 halves. Yehoshua as a Sefer, part 1 is the conquest, and part 2 is the division of the land according to tribes, what Chazal refer to as kibush and nachlo. Chazal say they take the same amount of time, 7 years and 7 years. That's not so clear in the Pshat, but certainly the book divides, there are 24 chapters in the book. It very neatly divides between chapters 1 and 12 is the conquest of Canaan, and from chapter 13 to 24 is the division of the land by tribes, what we call the nachlo. That's a very neat division. I'll show you at the end of chapter 12. Summary of all of the conquest of Canaan, all the nations of the kings of the land that Israel had conquered. They had started with Sichanog, and then they went Maraba, and they started with the nations and all of what Moshe started, then Yehoshua, and then you have this very beautiful, we'll talk about it at length when we get to chapter 12, you have a list of Yehoshua, the list of the kings that Yehoshua conquered. And who were they? Melech Yericho, Melech Ai, Melech Yerushalayim, Melech Hebron, Melech Yamut, Melech Lachish, and you have this whole list of Melech Netzachad, Kol Melachim Shloshim Ve'echad, 31 kings of Canaan that Israel had conquered. And that's sort of in the form of a shira that sets the tone, that concludes part 1 of the Sefer. Chapter 13, which begins the second half of the book, the Yehoshua Zaken Baba Yamim. Yeshua is already an old man. You've aged, and now the land remains very much unconquered, unpossessed. You need to enable Bnei Israel to begin to settle in their territory. And then it lists the places that have yet to be conquered. We'll talk about this chapter. But you can see the transition between chapter 12 and chapter 13. Yeshua Zaken, Baba Yamim. Okay, we're fast forwarding to the end of the story now. Yeshua is old, and the rest of it is about the tribal division of the land from chapter 13 to the end of the book. So that's one way to look at the division of the Sefer. The other observation is that within the first 12 chapters, which is what I call part one of the Sefer, the conquest, you also have two parts. You have everything we've done up until now, which is part one, namely the encouragement of Yehoshua, chapter 1, the spies in chapter 2, the crossing of the Jordan in chapters 3 and 4, the Brit, the mitzvot connected to the land, mitzvah Milah, the mitzvah Pesach in chapter 5, the conquest of Yericho, which is very similar to the story of Mount Sinai and the role of God and the role of the angel in felling the walls of Yericho, chapter 6, chapter 7 and 8, and then the blessing and curses, the Brit in the end of chapter 8 almost gets this. When you see it in this context, you almost understand why I was an aberration. I was a blip. They shouldn't have gone to I almost, because everything on this half of the chart is sort of the spiritual foundation, the Brit over the land, the Brit of Milah, the Brit of Pesach, the Brit of Berachot and Klalot, the Brit of the angel at Yericho. I sort of stuck in there in the middle of nowhere, and that was a problem for us. The second part of the story from chapter 9, 10, 11, and 12 now starts the conquest in earnest. Starts with the Givonim and the Brit with the Givonim, and then the story of the kings of the south, the story of the battle of the kings of the north, and then we're done. And then we chew out the shira of the summary. So it's a very powerful way to divide the Sefer as a whole. And the phrase that kind of navigates us through is this key phrase, Vehi Kishma. Vehi Kishma in the first half of the book, in chapter 5, right, the fear that overwhelmed, enveloped all the nations of Canaan. In chapters 9, 10, and 11, not so fearful anymore. Brit, conquest, war in the south, war in the north. They're hearing and they're gathering together to wage war, right? They're not hearing and running and melting away. They're hearing and they're gathering together. So you sort of get that context, that contrast. That contrast is isolated and fun and kind of zeroed in on in the story of I. I want to go back to a phrase that we learned in the story of I, and now you hear it. When Yehoshua was complaining to God after the first defeat at Ai, and he says, Mi Hashem, what can I say now after Israel has turned their backs before their enemies? When Israel was the initial battle in which they were defeated. V'yishma'u aknani. This will go and be heard. V'choyesh ve'aretz. And because they will hear what happened, they will turn against us. And they will cut off our name from the earth. What will you do to your great name then? We'll talk about the second half of this phrase in a second, but you hear Yeshua's fear. Yeshua's fear is Veishmur Knani. Nothing goes unheard. Right? They heard across the Yarden, they were afraid. Now they hear that we were defeated at Ai, and they're not afraid. And you see that in chapter 9, and you hear it in chapter 10, you see it again in chapter 11, and right? That's exactly the issue. So this phrase becomes the key around which the book navigates. We went from the Canaanites hearing and being afraid. After I, says Yehoshua, they're going to hear. Guess what? They heard. The Givonim heard, the Canaanites heard, the people in this Yerushalayim, the king of Yerushalayim heard, the king of the north of Chatzor heard, and they responded accordingly. That's exactly what Yehoshua was afraid of. That is precisely the concern. The other interesting thing about this phrase is that Yehoshua raises, in addition to the hearing, Yehoshua raises a really powerful piece about the name of God. We talk about the Chilul Hashem factor in the status of the Jewish people. I don't know if we talked about it. For some reason, I think it did. But Yehoshua raises what is simple is an argument that goes all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. at the moment of Chet HaEgel and Chet HaMeraglim. Ma Yamu Mitzrayim, what will the Egyptians say? They'll say that if you destroy them, they'll say that their God was was victorious. They'll say that you didn't have the strength to bring them into the land of Israel. Right? Moshe employed the argument of Chilul Hashem, that if you destroy Israel, it will be a desecration of your name, because Israel carries the name of God. We are God's people. And that is articulated here too. Says Yehoshua, what will you do with your great name? This appears over and over again in the Neviim, but no Navi articulated it more directly than Yechezkel. Yechezkel says it explicitly. He says, for example, and remember, Yechezkel lived after the destruction of the Beit Mikdash, or through the destruction, I should say. He lives in Babel. And in several places, for example, here in Yechezkel Perek Chaf, he talks about Israel, various places and times in Israel's life rebelled against God. Vayamrubi, they rebelled against me. Bamidbar, for example, B'chukatai lo alachu, v'mishpatai ma'asu, they rejected my statutes, they rejected my ordinances. They violated Shabbat. I wanted to destroy them. But I didn't. Why didn't I destroy them? I did not destroy them for the sake of my name that should not be desecrated in the eyes of the nations of the world. Because we carry in our very existence, we represent God's name in this world. Yechezkel says it again in chapter 36, in Yechezkel Amud Vav, in a very powerful way. He says it explicitly. He says, when he talks about the exile of Israel, Ben Adam, Israel lived in their land, this is post-exile, post-destruction, and they defiled it by way of their abominations and their idolatries. And I poured out my wrath upon them for the blood they spilt in the land and for the violations of the idolatry that they defiled herewith. And I scattered them throughout the nations. And I dispersed them through the nations of the world. They came to the nations where they were dispersed. And they desecrated my name. Now, you could argue, as many have, that our behavior desecrated God's name because typically when you talk about somebody who represents Judaism, who represents religious life, and he misbehaves, you say, oh, you're creating a Chilul Hashem. To Yechezkel, the concept of Chilul Hashem is much bigger than how we behave. The very exile itself is a desecration of God's name. Why? Because these people are God's people. And if they've been exiled from their land, that means that God's people has been defeated and exiled from their land. That's a Chilul Hashem. That's an extraordinary Chilul Hashem. That's what the Neviim talked about. And therefore, in Yechezkel's context, there's a promise of redemption because God won't allow his name to be desecrated for eternity. And the promise of redemption is based on the need to rectify this Chilul Hashem. That's exactly Yeshua's argument back in Ai. Vishmo Knani, the Canaanites will hear that we were defeated. What will you do to your great name? That's really the issue. And what we see now is the response. How do we respond to the impact of the failure at Ai, and then eventually the brit with the Givonim, which we'll see in the coming chapter, and how it navigates to the response of the Canaanites. All right, so that brings us to and the other, okay, that was the first part of what I wanted to discuss. This very interesting thing is observation here is Yeshua's constant concern about the unity of the kings of the nations of Canaan. On the one hand, it's very strategic. Yehoshua is fighting the clock. He doesn't want the nations to unite, and you see them uniting here in against the Givonim. You see them uniting here against Yehoshua. You see them uniting in the north. The more they unite, the greater the threat they become. There's a spiritual dimension to that unity that's also important to note, and it's based on a Medrash Tanchuma, or it's reflected, it's articulated in a Medrash Tanchuma. Medrash says something really interesting. Go back to Parshat Noach, and you have in the story of Migdal Bavel, Vayikol haaretz safa achat u'dvarim achadim. The whole world united under one banner, that banner being the tower that Nimrod built. Says the Medrash, Rabbi Ibo b'shem Rabbi Yossi Haglili Omer. Rabbi Ibo taught in the name of Rabbi Yossi Haglili. There are three places in the history of Tanakh which all the nations of the world, or all the nations relevant to the discussion, should say, bound together to unite against God. From the word machloket, they strove against, united against God. What are those three places? Achat kan, one is here, Migdal Bavel, Vayikol haaretz safa achat u'dvarim achadim. V'achat b'mei Yehoshua, and the other is in the days of Yehoshua, as it says, beginning of our chapter, Vaytkaptzu yachdav lilachem im Yehoshua v'Yisrael pe'achad, unified in their opposition, in their effort to fight against and destroy Israel. And the third is b'mei Gog u'Magog, as it says in Tehillim, Yityatzvu malchei eretz v'roznim nostu yachad, all of the kings of the earth stood and took counsel, al Hashem mi'al Mashicho, against God and against his anointed. So what I find interesting in this Medrash is that two of these instances, Migdal Bavel and this reference to Gog and Magog, or reference to Tehillim, in both those instances, the nations are clearly united in an effort against some aspect of divine, whatever that is. But safa achat u'dvarim achadim, God directly intervenes, and in Gog and Magog it says explicitly, Al Hashem be'al Mashicho. In our case, it says they united against Yehoshua. It doesn't say they united against God. And yet the Medrash sees that as a unity against God, precisely for the reason we just explained, that in the Tanakh perspective, Israel carries the name of God on their shoulders. They represent God. We are God's people. And so if we are threatened, then God's name is threatened in the world. This Medrash really spells it out because it even takes it just for granted. Their effort against Israel is precisely an effort against God. When Amalek came to fight against Israel, what does the pasuk say in Bishalach? Milchama laHashem ba'Amalek midor dor. God's battle against Amalek, because Amalek came to threaten Israel. That's the theme that runs through this Medrash as well. So that's the kind of way of seeing the whole picture. One of the things that I mentioned or I entitled this chapter, this shir today, is the intersection of human effort and divine providence. The notion that there is a kind of a strategic, political, geopolitical perspective and understanding in events that are taking place. And at the same time, there's also a kind of a broader spiritual, divine intervention, if you will, in the events. In other words, the same event can be described in the Tanakh as happening from the vantage point of a geopolitical calculation, the nations of Canaan united against Israel, and can also be seen as a kind of a spiritual dimension to the same facts. This is happening because God wills it to happen, so to speak. And that's true on so many levels throughout Tanakh. I was looking for one pasuk to see it. I think I left out the reference for it. Sorry, my apologies. It is viewed tet. I'll give you an example. If I ask the question, why did the Givonim come to make peace with Israel? Right, what's the answer? Why did the Givonim come to make peace with Israel? They were afraid after they saw what happened at Ai and what happened at Yericho. They were afraid, right? But if you take a look in Yeshua Perek Yud Aleph, 2 chapters from now, towards the end of the parak, let's go to Pasuk Yutet. Lo hayta ir asher ishlima el bnei Yisrael. There was not a single city in Israel, in the Canaan, that had made peace with Israel rather than war. Bilti achivi yoshvei Givon, with the exception of the Hivites in Givon. And the kol lakhu b'milchama. All the other nations fought in battle. But the Givonim, not. Ki me'et Hashem hayta. The nations of Canaan fought and didn't take the pattern of the Givonim. They didn't make peace with Israel. God hardened their hearts to enable them to wage war with Israel, so that they could be destroyed and then have no holding no favor in the land, in order to be destroyed as God commanded Moshe.
What does it mean? את הכל לקחו במלחמה. I don't understand. Who
Israel took all the other nations.
Israel.
All had conquered all the other areas by battle rather than by treaty.
Right.
Only Givon was by treaty. So,
but we did give them an option of a peace treaty.
We'll get to all of that. We'll get to all of that. That's exactly it. We gave them an option of peace, and with the exception of Givon, they all chose a path of war. So the text says they chose a path of war because, as it says, as we just said, because they saw that there was a weakness and they decided to exploit it, etc. But
why did they have to come b'mirma?
Well, we'll get to the Givonim. I haven't started the Givonim. I just want to understand the concept.
Okay.
Right? That we'll get to all those questions, but from taking one step above 10,000 feet high perspective, the text says that there's a certain divine push, divine providence, God hardening their hearts to enable them to go to war with Israel so that we were able to conquer and control the land. So every action that takes place happens on two levels. And this is true throughout Tanakh. There is a geopolitical calculation, why this choice, why this place, why this war, why this battle, why this decision. And then there's a divine level of orchestration that doesn't negate human free will, but is happening at the same time. What do I mean by that? Why is it significant? Let's take just a quick look, for example, at what Yehoshua does when he enters into the land. First thing he does is he crosses the Jordan, and from the Jordan, he wants to get to Shechem. Before he gets to Shechem, he conquers Yericho. He crosses the Jordan, separates the east side of the Jordan from the west side of the Jordan, crosses the Jordan, and battles against Yericho. And then he moves to the city of Ai. Unclear why, right? Doesn't really need to go to Ai. But he goes to Ai. Ai, Beit El are sister cities right next to each other. And from there, he goes up to Shechem, assuming everything's in sequence. Then he heads down south to deal with Yerushalayim up through Hebron, Devir, Lachish, Yerushalayim, right? And then he's going to head up north. In other words, if I look at the sequence of cities that Yehoshua conquers for purely strategic geopolitical reasons, they are essentially Yericho, Ai / Beit El, Shechem, and Hebron, or the region in the south, north to south. We'll go back to the story of Abraham when he first comes into the land of Israel. What's the first place Abraham comes to when he enters the land? The first place he comes to is Shechem. ויבוא אברהם בארץ עד מקום שכם, עד אילון מורה. What's the second place Avram comes to when he enters the land? Right? Bethel. וירא השם אל אברהם ויאמר לזרעך אתן את הארץ הזאת. After God promises him he will have this land and he builds a mizbeach, ויעתק משמרה, he heads south, he's coming in from the north, he heads south from Shechem to Bethel. And Bethel, ויתו עלו מבית-אל מים, והאי מקדם. Somewhere between Beit-El and Ai. So he goes from Shechem down to Beit-El to Ai, and from there he will head even further south. In other words, the very same line that Yehoshua takes, which is Ai, Shechem, Hebron, that's the same line that Abraham took, although Abraham was coming from the north. He didn't come from the center of the country, he came from the north. So he comes to Shechem first, then he goes to Ai Beit El, and then he goes down to Hebron. And what's interesting is that Yaakov takes the same journey. When Yaakov comes back to the land, when Yaakov first enters the land, he enters, if you remember, coming from the house of Lavan along the Yabok River, and he enters and he crosses from the Jordan River and he heads to Shechem, Vayavo Yaakov Shalem Ir Shechem, most likely along this same road that the Torah refers to as Derech Mavor Shemesh. And he comes to Shechem. And then from there, in Perek Lamed Gimel, to Perek Lamed Hey, as the whole story with Dinah, which is not relevant to our discussion right now, Perek Lamed Hey begins, Vayomer Elokim Yaakov Kuma le Beit El. Go to Beit El, because that's where you built a Mizbeach. And from Beit El, Vayavo Yaakov Yitzchak Aviv Mamre Kiyat Arba Hebron. So Yaakov takes the very same journey, Shechem, Beit El, Hebron.
So they take the top of the mountain. That's strategically to be on the mountain.
Yes, and that's exactly my point, is that there's always a strategic political calculation to what they're doing, but there's also, take a step back, and from the perspective of Tanakh, that's what the Ramban refers to when he says, Maseh Avot Siman Lebanim. There's always this divine orchestration of events. There's always this statement of, okay, that's your calculation, here's my calculation. God is also involved in this. And God's calculation is to see Yehoshua and the kind of the pattern of the Avot as the pattern by which we begin to tread in the land of Israel. Now, that's not because Yehoshua chose to go to Hebron. He chose to go to Hebron in response to the unity of the kings of Yerushalayim and the environs. But in the end, the result is that Yehoshua takes the center of the country, the mountain range from north to south, calculated to divide east and west, to divide the north from the south, to control strategically the heartland and the mountain range of the land. But at the same time, suddenly there is a pattern that goes all the way back to the Avot that links us to the cities of Beit El, Ai, Shechem, Hebron, Yerushalayim, right? All that whole ridge of cities that comes back to the Avot. Okay.
Could it be also that the Plishtim were sitting there by the sea, and they were afraid of them, and that's why it says what you read before, that they took over everything except the cities of the Plishtim.
Plishtim are much less of a calculation for now. They will become much more of a calculation, say, for Shoftim. They're there, but they are.
But I think it's like it's an omen for the future that they didn't conquer them. And then they became like such a big enemy.
We'll see that much more, but it's not just the Plishtim. It's also all, we see it up here, and we'll see at the end of, when we get to chapter 13, we start listing all the places that they didn't conquer and why they didn't conquer them. We'll get to that at the second half of the Sefer. But Plishtim are a part of that calculation for sure. Okay, let's jump now back into the story itself. So I want to read it through and get a sense of the whole piece for the sake of everybody, so we're all on the same page. And then we'll start to analyze what I would call the for lack of a better term, the halachic question involved. So we talked about the unity of the Canaanites gathering together to fight against Israel. And in contrast to them, you have Yoshvei Givon, the inhabitants of Givon, which we'll see is not just one city of Givon. There are 4 Givonite cities that sort of form an alliance. They're referred to as the 4 cities of the Givonim. We'll point them out in a moment. ויושבי גבעון שמעו את אשר עשה יהושע ליריחו ולעי, ויעשו גם המה בעורמה, וילכו ויצטיירו. Some suggest this should be ויצטיידו, because that's the word that's used later on. They went and they made themselves as messengers, or they equipped themselves with worn clothes and and food that was stale, and wine sacks that had been emptied and had holes in them, as if they had come from a faraway place. They come to Yehoshua in Gilgal in base camp. They said to Yehoshua, to the leadership of Israel, we've come from a faraway land, now make a brit with us. Ish Yisrael responds to the Chivites and says, maybe not so fast. Maybe you were amongst us. Maybe you are one of the local tribes. How do we know that you're from a far away? And if you're from a local tribe, Canaanites, we're not allowed to make a brit with you. Yehoshua, they said to Yehoshua, we are your servants. Yehoshua said to them, who are you and where do you come from? We've come from a very far away land. We've come for the sake of your name of your God. We heard all that he did in Egypt. And we heard what he did to the 2 kings on the other side of the Jordan. Notice that he doesn't mention I, because the whole point of the ruse is to say that they're local, that they're far away. So if they say they heard about I, then it's a dead giveaway that they're local. So our elders and our people said to us, go take provisions and go on a journey and go meet them, and say we are your servants, and now make a brit with us. And to prove their points, we took this hot food from our house for the journey. The day we left. And it's dried out and it's like crumbs because it was a long journey. And these wine skins which we filled are now, they've torn, there are holes in them. And the shoes and our garments, very long journey, they were worn through, which is kind of reminds us of the pasuk at the end of the Dvarim, that Bnei Yisrael walked through the desert for 40 years and they didn't wear out their shoes or wore through their clothing. Right here, they came from a short journey and they'd wear a not so short journey, and their clothes was all worn through. The men took their provisions. They didn't ask counsel from God. They broke bread together, to put it into language of Tanakh. They broke bread, they sat, they took their food. That's a sign of an acceptance of a partnership, and they ate together. Yeshua made peace with them and a covenant to let them live. And the princes of the congregation swore to them, took an oath. Next week, not today, next week, we'll analyze who said what to whom, because there's a lot of people talking in a lot of different levels of this conversation. So if you want to do some homework, you can kind of reread the parak and ask yourself, who's speaking and to whom in every sentence. Next week, we'll chart it out. For now, I'm just taking the story at face value. 3 days later, after they made this brit with them, and they heard. These Givonim went back to their town and they started to celebrate, and they realized that they were just over the next hill. They were neighbors. They were a 3-day journey. And the 3rd day, they came to their cities. Ve'arehem, who are their cities? Givon, Kfira, Be'erot, and Kiryat Ye'arim. Givon, which is today known as an Arab village called Daljib, Kfira, Be'erot, and Kiryat Ye'arim. Kiryat Ye'arim is known today as the city of, what Jewish city is called Kiryat Ye'arim? Big sign as you enter Kiryat Ye'arim, Telstone. Kiryat Ye'arim is Telstone of today's map, and Abu Ghosh on the Arab map of cities. So you have 4 cities, and we know exactly where they are. You can kind of see them here on the map. Here's the area, of Givon. Yerushalayim, Gilgal is here, and Ai is here. They're back in base camp in Gilgal, and Givon is just over the ridge, northwest of Yerushalayim, city of Abu Ghosh, city of Telstone, today.
Sorry, could you repeat, please, what they are today, the 4 cities?
So there's a easiest way to see that is I'll show you on a map. If anybody's interested in this this is a very interesting website. It's run by, it was set up by Shivat Har Etzion, the Michal Herzog, and it has an option. Can everybody see this map that this website? You can pull up any page, any page of Tanakh, any parak in Tanakh. Let's pull up any parak in Tanakh. Sorry, it's a little slow.
Which website is it? 1 minute.
Hatanakh.com. But you have to be careful how you spell it. Hatanakh.com. Tanakh.com or .org. It just takes a little bit of time. That's because I'm on a Zoom call. So why should anything go smoothly when you're on technology? Oh, come on. Okay. Now, once you pull up a parak in Tanakh, amongst the various options you have is a map. And if you go to the map and you go to a full-size page of the map, they have a partnership with Google, and there's a Google engine that runs this map. And you can pick any parak in Tanakh or any sequence of parakim from one place to another, and you can pull up the cities that are mentioned in the parak. But what's particularly interesting is you can also superimpose a modern map on top of it. So now you have, here's Yerushalayim, here's the city of Givon, here's Givat Ze'ev, here's Givon, here's Kfira, here's Kiryat Ye'arim, which is Telstone or Abu Ghosh today on modern map, and sort of some of the cities overlooking the Highway 1, some of them closer to the 443, but essentially this area here is the area of the Givonim. So it's just a observation, just an interesting way to look at biblical maps.
Wasn't Kiryat Ye'arim where the Aron HaKodesh was, where they kept Aron HaKodesh?
Givon? Yes.
No, Kiryat Ye'arim.
Yes. Yes. Later on. Okay. Back to the story. So now they have a dilemma. The Givonim lied to them. Israel had every right to go to war with them. They chose not to. They chose not to smite them. Because the elders of Israel had taken an oath in God's name. And to violate that oath, to come back to a theme we started this year today, right, would be a chilul Hashem, would be a desecration of God's name. And the people came to complain to the Neviim, how could you do this? Then we made a brit now with local Canaanites. We took an oath in God's name. We can't touch them. So what can we do? We can obligate them to serve Israel and be loyal to to recognizing Jewish sovereignty. And we'll let them live. We can't allow, and we don't want God's anger to be against us because of a violation of an oath. Let them live. And so they became what was referred to as chotvei etzim v'shoavei mayim, hewers of wood and drawers of water. So a reference to a kind of service that appears actually in the beginning in Parshat Nitzavim. Also, you have mechotvei etzecha ad shoei memecha, similar kind of service. We'll see at the end of the parak. They get annexed to service of the Mikdash or Mishkan or temple as well. That's why the Aron eventually goes to Kiryat Yarim. Yehoshua calls them open. He says, why did you lie to us? We are why did you lie to us? Why did you say that you are from far away when you're really here in a neighbor? You should be cursed. You will be forever this status of an Eved, to the temple of God. They said to Yehoshua, we heard that God had commanded Moshe and commanded you to destroy all the Canaanites. We were afraid, and therefore we did this. We are in your hands. Whenever is good in your eyes, we will do. We are loyal. And so he did and saved them from the hands of Israel, who wanted to kill them, and Yehoshua wouldn't let them. And they gave them a status in Israel. They made them in the status of, right, Mizbeach needs wood, Mizbeach needs water, and operation in the Mikdash. They made them essentially servants of the Mikdash, wherever it would be, wherever the Mizbeach would be. Now it's in Gilgal. Eventually it would then move to Shiloh, and it would stay in Shiloh for several hundred years, and then maybe even eventually to the Mikdash. That is the end of the parak. So there's a lot to unpack in this story. Obvious questions. Why did they feel they needed to act in guile, be'orma? Why couldn't they just come to Israel and say, hey, you know what? We don't want you to destroy us. Let's make a brit. Why did they think they needed to go around about as if they were not from the Canaanites? Why does Yehoshua, in fact, accept them in the end, even though they took an oath? That's an oath on false pretense. And also an oath on false pretense. Why is that even binding?
Why did Yehoshua not ask Urim and Tumim?
Why that's no one asked? It says clearly that they didn't, right? It says explicitly that they didn't ask the Urim and Tumim. It says that that was a very, very major overstep, that they didn't. That pi Hashem lo shalu. Text says explicitly that they didn't ask Hashem. That also is a question. Why not? Who's the conversation with? Who took the oath? And there's a bunch of different people involved in the story. There's Yehoshua, there's the Neviim, there's the Zkenim, there's the people. A whole bunch of different players in this conversation. And what role does this whole story of the Givonim play in the broader picture of Sefer Yehoshua? These are all questions that we need to unpack. There's also the bigger Tanakh picture, what happens to these Givonim? Givonim are a tragic story. We know from Sefer Shmuel that Shaul Hamelech had gone to war against the Givonim, and was in fact one of the critiques of Shaul was that he violated this oath and went to war against the Givonim. That's part of this dynamic in Sefer Shmuel and why that was the case and how David responded to them. So there's a broader historical context to the Givonim that is also relevant. It all goes all the way up to Shlomo Melech and the building of the Beit HaMikdash. So there's a lot of stories related to this. This is the foundation, and we're going to talk next week. We're going to talk about, well, not next week, because Moshe next week, but next year, we're going to talk about what the impact of this oath is and why it was why the Givonim felt it was necessary and why Bnei Israel felt it was necessary to honor it and how that impacted for generations to come. So that's our goal today. We kind of did an introduction and an overview, bird's eye overview of the Sefer, as well as the introduction to the story itself. One word of observation of the scheduling. Next Tuesday, I am traveling back to the US, so we will not be able, I will not be able to have a class in this time slot. I'll literally be at the airport. So that's in a too hard basket. The week following that is Shavuot. And unbeknownst to the organizers of Torah in Motion, the week following Shavuot, I just accepted an invitation to an AIPAC rabbinic conference in DC. So I will not be available that Tuesday night either. I will be in the middle of a dinner, hopefully interviewing Congressman Wesley Bell and telling his story. So we are actually going to be regrouping 4 weeks from today. That's a long time. But I apologize for that. There's just nothing I could do with the schedule as it is. I did not want to shift to a different day or time. It's too complicated. So the next 3 weeks we're off. Hopefully we'll regather our forces, and then from mid-June through certainly mid-July, if not the end of July, we should be able to go straight.
Rabbi, בהצלחה רבה.
B'vakasha, toda rabba. Thank you to you all for listening, and Bezrat Hashem will continue. We'll pick this up in a couple of weeks.
Thank you very much.
Thank
They
you.
get mazel tov on the bar mitzvah.
Thank you.
Safe travels.
Thank you very much.
נסיעה טובה.